Hello Steamians, Bucky Dirtle here. Welcome back to another tutorial. I'm doing a tutorial today on Helm. Helm, the software synthesizer. Now Helm is a software synthesizer that I love, and I keep saying it because it is fantastic. I've had an opportunity over the years to use a lot of analog synthesizers, and using analog synthesizers give us full control over every aspect of the sound we're producing. And Helm emulates that. So Helm tries to give us the same sensation as if we're using like a Moog Voyager or an ARP 2600, except without all the soldering and all the fixing and the wires. Okay, so Helm is fantastic. We all know that. So now let's get into how to use one component of the Helm software synthesizer, and this is the cross modulation control. Now, in other videos that you've seen me do, I've talked about oscillator number 1 and oscillator number 2, and how we can combine those two to produce some basic sounds. Now, I haven't gotten into sound design yet with you about what you do with certain sounds and certain oscillators to create certain sounds you may want. I think what you need to do at this point is just experiment and see what you find. So in a previous tutorial, I talked to you about the transpose and what that does for us. And I also talked about combining different waveforms. We have a saw wave on the oscillator 2, and we have a sine wave on oscillator 1, and gives us this sound. Depending on what we do, we're going to get different sounds, and how we combine these sounds together, we get different sounds. And you may be looking for a certain sound that may be a combination of oscillator 1 on a sine wave and oscillator 2 on a square wave. Oh, I don't know. It could be anything. It's virtually limitless. So what I wanted to do today is talk to you about cross modulation. Now, I'm going to put one on the sine wave and one on a saw wave, just for simplicity. Now, we'll try a few more in a minute, but the modulation wheel is right here in the middle. Now, what modulation does, cross modulation takes information from both the oscillators, and it uses the information from one oscillator to affect the sound of the other oscillator, and vice versa. So what it does is the oscillator 1, the information oscillator 1, that affects the phase of oscillator 2. So we're not going to get into what phase is. You can look it up, but I just want to mention it now. It does affect the phase. So as wave 1 is going up and down in its pattern, where it is on that pattern affects that the data is used to change the phase of oscillator 2. Oscillator 2, the up and down information of oscillator number 2 changes the tone of oscillator 1. So once again, oscillator 1, the information from oscillator 1 affects the sound of oscillator 2, and oscillator 2 affects the sound of oscillator 1. Very cool stuff. So at the end of the day, it's nice to know that technically, but as a musician myself, I just want to know how it sounds. That's the most important thing to me. So in an earlier video, I explained that with Helm, you're able to assign any of the control surfaces to buttons and sliders on your keyboard. Now I'm sitting in front of a workstation, a Korg workstation, so I can turn a knob and it will change the cross modulation wheel here in the middle of the oscillators. You can see that there. That gives me a little bit more control, a little bit more physical control, but I can use my mouse. Just you can see it here, I'm using my mouse. I can go up and down with my mouse as much as I want. It's the same deal, okay? But here's what the effect is, okay? So this is no modulation at all. You can see the way it changes as I rotate the wheel. Now let's just try some other ones. And sometimes it's more dramatic depending on what we have. Let's go with a square and a lattice. Okay, here it is with no modulation. And as I increase my modulation, you can hear it changing. And then it gets to a point where it'll break up, where it'll just start creating some noise and distortion. Let's try some other ones. Let's try that and that. And some of them are more pronounced than others. If we go sine wave and So you can get different sounds, and what you're going to find in some of the, and if you switch, oh sorry, I meant to mention earlier, if I have a sine wave here and a sawtooth on one side, and then number 2, like that, I'll get certain sound. If I switch them around, I have saw in this side and a sine in that number 2, it will be a different result. Now you're going to find that some of these controls, some of these components like cross modulation will give you very subtle changes. It won't be wide, big, massive changes like some components will. Some will be very subtle and it's fine tuning. So you may want to start playing with it, and you may find that like just a touch of this or a touch of that will give you exactly the sound you're looking for. So be patient with that and be creative, because sometimes the subtlety is what's going to make it really, really cool. Some of the sounds you may just play and right away I'll say, oh, that sounds like a great bass part, a real thick synth bass part or something. But then you start fine tuning it. You can make it exactly the way you want. So all kinds of nice harmonies in the sound and make it exactly the way you want it to be. So this is one of these fine tuning things that is very subtle, but it will give you some great control over the sound you're creating. So that's cross modulation in between the two oscillators. Now, I forgot to mention earlier that you notice that I have both of these oscillators set at basically the same volume level. But depending on what you do with your sliders, you may be able to get different results with your cross modulation by increasing one or decreasing another, and you have to play with that to get the results you want. But also, if I were you, I'd keep a journal of what these changes are. If you find that by doing a certain thing will give you a certain result, jot it down in your journal. Because this stuff is complicated. It is complicated. The results are really cool, and it's easy to get easy sounds, good sounds. But when you get really fine-tuned and when you get really into how to use this software, you want to keep some notes so that when you go back, you're not saying, how did I get that to work again? Oh, there was 10 different changes and buttons and switches. Write it down so then you know what you did. And when you come back later, you can reproduce exactly the sound you wanted. Okay, thank you for watching this one today. It's cross modulation between two oscillators. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I appreciate the opportunity with utopian.io and Steemit to be able to show you these tutorials. If you have any questions for me directly, feel free to hit me up in the Steemit chats, and you can also find me on the PAL Discord. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.